Welcome to the collision.
The Collision, where sports and politics smash. Thursdays at 10 a.m. and on iTunes and Google Play. WPFW, Washington, D.C.
Welcome to On the Margin with E. Ethelbert Miller. My guest today is Martha Jones. Martha Jones is the author of The Trouble of Color, an American Family Memoir. She's also the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and Professor of History at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. How are you doing today, Martha?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for being my guest on Margin. I want to take you back to 1976, 1977. You mentioned this sort of in the beginning of your book. Talk about the influence of Alex Haley's book, Roots, and also the miniseries that was on television. I think we were both in our 20s back then. Does the family memoir begin with the door Haley opened?
Absolutely. I think that Alex Haley's story and the platform that is extended to the Roots story, the kind of critical acclaim that comes to the story, the way in which, back in the day, we actually watched television in real time. And so we set aside those evenings and we sat together as families to watch that story. I think it sends a message to so many of us that our families have stories, that we have histories as families, but as communities, as Black people, and that those are stories that should also be preserved, remembered, told and retold. I don't know how you talk about Black family history in the last generations without some kind of tribute.
Well, let's go back to that because
yeah.
did you have, okay, you're watching and you got to wait for the next episode, right?
Absolutely.
And I used to joke, I said, if somebody called you when the Roots was on TV, you knew they were white because every Black person was watching Roots. But I wonder, did your family, have discussions after watching an episode?
It's so interesting that you asked me that because I remember distinctly my father giving me the book for my birthday. And it felt like a kind of bequeath, he was not just passing to me, Haley's story. He was ushering me into, right, storytelling that would include my own storytelling. I'm not as ambitious as I might appear today back in the 1970s, but it is something that launches me in scribbling down stories and charting family
I'm laughing at,
trees.
I'm laughing at this because, we're doing a Zoom, and this is radio, but I'm looking at your hands and you sort of have that thing where people are lifting their babies up in Roots. So when you were mentioning the book, you were sort of lifting it up
It's
like
true.
that. But I find it interesting that you gave you the book because, many people, they didn't really look at the book. They were looking at the movie, the TV miniseries, which was making all sorts of records.
Yeah, but television was ephemeral, right?
Mhm.
When you watched a miniseries and you didn't know when you would see it again. We're before
Right.
the VHS and before streaming, certainly. And so the book was the object you could hold in your hands, you could set on your shelf, me to carry it with you off to college. It was the object, and television was the thing that came and went.
All right. Now, you mentioned in your acknowledgments in your book, The Trouble of Color, um, you mentioned that your book is indebted to everyone who has been snagged by the color line. When you talk about being snagged by the color line, what do you mean? Now, I'm looking at the word snagged.
Mm. Well, I think the metaphor of the line suggests something smooth and straight and defining. Um, and the story I try and tell in The Trouble of Color really is about people, my people, who, when we get close to the line, when we cross the line, when we're pulled across the line, it turns out that it's not a defining divide between so-called Black and so-called white people. It is this place that troubles us. And whether some of the stories in this book are about, small interpersonal confrontations, right, along the color line that wound. But others of them are about, folks who are evading the state, evading the law, evading the threats to their very families and their well-being, also in these encounters with the line that says you're black or you're white, and never the two meet.
You used a word there I want you to respond to. You mentioned the word wound, and I was wondering in terms of, you've written up this family memoir, but in terms of your own life, have you been wounded? Now, are there any scars that you feel that even still now, as you're doing research, that you're trying to heal yourself?
Absolutely. I wish I could say that I was such an actualized person at every encounter. And I'll tell you I think a strange one, but I think one that has never left me. Um, Probably 15 years ago, I live in New York. I go into my local post office because it's the holiday season, and I am going to purchase my Kwanzaa stamps to put on my holiday cards. And I get to the counter, the counter, the scene at the post office,
Right.
and they're in a hurry and all the things. And I ask for my Kwanzaa stamps. And the sister behind the counter sort of leans back and says, "I'm not sure you want Kwanzaa stamps." And I said, damn. I said, now what am I to say in the face of that? It is this ordinary encounter. Everybody has a story about being wounded at the post office, right?
Right.
But for me, that's the sort of moment where I think, am I now going to bare my soul to this woman, and there are 15 people in the line behind me, on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Am I going to agree to take the Christmas stamps instead of the Kwanzaa stamps? But I confess it's a wound in the sense that, even as I retell it to you, I feel the tightness in my chest, and I feel the sting of
I
such an
wonder,
ordinary moment.
looking ahead, I wonder if the government will permit us to have
Kwanzaa stamps, thank you
Kwanzaa
very much.
stamps. When you look at what's happening in terms of taking over the post office,
That is
but that's
true.
another story. But going from what you just said about yourself, how does one, Martha Jones, how does one merge or connect the family stories of the heart with research documents?
Mm. I think that turned out to be one of the dilemmas in writing this book, because that I was trained to work with and to rely on the kind of official state record of many things, including families. So censuses and death certificates, wills, pension records. And it is also true that when we begin to take seriously our family stories, the things that have come down to us orally, the things that have come to us scribbled on, the backs of photographs. Well, it turns out those two things don't fit together well. And for me in this book, it was an opportunity to pivot, frankly, and to honor the stories as they had been scribbled on the backs of photographs, as they had been passed down to me, and to understand that that so-called official record was just another form of storytelling. It wasn't, it was written out of a set of interests by men who had very little interest of our families in mind. They're bureaucrats, right? Trying to count people and many other things. And so I resolved the dilemma by taking seriously the stories that come through to us from family, and doing in my own way the work of trying to fill in the gaps and connect the dots in those stories.
Well, I'm wondering how you handle when you make this discovery of, say, family secrets. And then also, I mean, we'll talk about some specific members in your family. But there is one of your relatives, Dallas, who sort of disappears. I mean, how do you handle, I mean, I was reading how you thought, well, this could have happened, this could have happened, but you're uncovering something that maybe there was a reason why he disappeared. That's very painful. It was a family secret.
Of course. And I think you
So
paused.
mention about Dallas, who.
Sure. So Dallas Jones was my grandfather's father, born in central North Carolina in the Piedmont, a free man of color who settles in the city of Greensboro, has many vocations. He's a saloon keeper. He's a lamp lighter. He's a shoemaker. But his real calling is politics. He's a radical Republican on through the 1880s and into the 1890s as white supremacy, democratic rule really takes hold in North Carolina. It's a very dangerous time to be a
There's a period of
Republican.
Reconstruction.
It is the end, and it is the end of Reconstruction and what some historians called redemption and the rise of Jim Crow. And Dallas is a very visible, very forceful advocate for Black rights, even into the 1890s. And he, along with 399 or so other Black men in Greensboro, are targeted by white Democrats in the early 1890s on a broadside that hangs in saloons and parlors and is passed around. And it basically says to poll watchers, keep an eye out for these men and make sure that they don't vote. And as you suggest, that's the last sign I'm able to discover of Dallas. And whether he fled, whether he blended into another world using his skin as a vehicle for becoming someone else, or whether he was the direct target of the violence that was so endemic to that period. As you say, I
Well,
cannot say.
let me mention this, ask you this question, because now it seems here you are, you're working on this family memoir, you're doing this research, but now it seems like you have to become a detective. And so what happened? I'm wondering what happens when you are going through document and you see the trail ending.
Mm. Well, the backstory is you keep going, right?
Hmm.
So what you don't put on the page, or at least I don't put on the page, are the many, many hours, that I continue to spend, in newspapers, in censuses, and anywhere I might look to find Dallas, going back over the family stories. Did I overlook something? Um, and so there's a lot you do before you say to a reader, as I do, this is where the trail ends. And that's important because that is a true reporting of where the story ends, but also because it's a reminder that we don't always have the capacity to tell our stories, to their natural end or to their far
Yeah,
going end.
when I listen to you, I go back. I remember reading about Malcolm X father, being mysteriously killed,
Mm-hmm.
because he was in the UNIA, I think, at that time. And so you sort of hear these stories, but then if you years later, many years later, if you're a family historian, how do you try to resolve that? Okay, did this actually happen?
Yeah, I guess I think in this book, I think I don't. And that's
Hmm.
deliberate on my part, which is to say, my my position as the writer is not to correct the stories that other people have told. It really is to sit my story alongside the other stories. And when it comes to Dallas, to come back to Dallas, his son, who was probably the most faithful recounter of his family's past, never says a word about the end of his father's life. And so I am coming behind him, seeing if I might find another way to end the story. But in my own way, I inherit the silence right? My great uncle, who had written so much about his family, he knew what happened to his father, some version, right? They had some version, and it wasn't a story that got passed to us at
Martha
all.
Jones, talk about the difference between memoir and family memoir.
Mm. Well, for me, and I have to um, pay small tribute to Casey Lehman, whose subtitle I borrowed and adapted in this book
That's why you were at that conference last year.
Absolutely, that, I mean, Lemons Heavy is a for I think many of us a model of how to approach memoir, but it is not a story in which I am a principal character throughout. It is a family memoir in that I try and do the work of centering back across 5 generations, many other members of my family. I can't stand in their shoes, but I try and foreground their story. And it is also true that I become a character by way of recounting for you some of the experience of actually doing the research and trying to surface their stories.
You could also say that The Trouble of Color is also, to some extent, a history of Bennett College.
It could, yeah.
And talk about why that is. Talk about.
Sure. Yeah. So we talked about Dallas Jones, and Dallas's youngest son was my grandfather, David Jones, who was for near 30 years between the 1920s and the 1950s, the president of Bennett College. Still today, one of our HBCUs for women in Greensboro, North Carolina. My grandfather was born and raised as a young person in Greensboro, left, sent away to go to school, began his professional life, and in 1926 was called home to take over the institution that his own mother had as a former slave, had a role in founding in a church basement there in Greensboro. His siblings had been students at Bennett, and he comes back in 1926 and dedicates the rest of his life to building that place.
We'll talk about the other half. Talk about Musi.
Yeah, please. So my grandmother, Musi, is his partner in all things. And anyone who has spent any time on a campus as intimate and is steeped in the legacies of the HBCUs knows that my grandmother had as much to do with the building of Bennett as did my grandfather, who enjoyed the title of president. But my grandmother was from Danville in Kentucky, and had been raised in Cincinnati and St. Louis. She came from the big city, and they say she cried for weeks after they landed in Greensboro and realized what a backwater she had landed in. But North Carolina becomes her home, and she lives there until the 1980s.
I asked that question because one, many times um, women get overlooked.
Mhm.
But then I also look at the fact that you are writing this family memoir and you are a woman. So what happens? You're sensitive to those issues. You can bring those issues, which would be in a backdrop into someone else's book, to the forefront. How do you balance in terms of matriarch and patriarch, that you give your father and your mother's side equal billing?
Mm. Well, I would say, for me in this book, this is really principally a story about my father's family. And stay tuned because I'm doing some writing about my mother's
So
family.
I'm getting an exclusive here, right?
You are getting the sneak preview. My mother, who is the child of German and Irish immigrants, has a very different family story, but one that has been important to also for me to surface. So this is really a story about my father's family, and I think one of the things that I wasn't sure that I would write about my father, in part because it required me to kind of jump across that gender divide, right? I had been writing principally chapters that were driven by the women in my family, and there was my father, but that seemed important and that seemed right in the end. But it's also true that I think men are more elusive in our memories. It's the women in my family who hold the memories, who pass them down, who literally pass you the paper or the photograph or the letter. And so part of what I discovered are the ways in which the women in my family had been, to an important degree, right, the keepers of the stories and the passing them down, but not only, right? And that's why figures like my grandfather, my father, and others also play an important part in the story.
How do you handle
Mm.
how do you handle family members? I believe you have a few family members who have made attempt to say write their own memoir or put something down. Might be a few chapters,
Yeah.
and you say, okay, well, this is nice they did this, but I really can't believe what they're saying here.
Well, I think that if I were writing this book as a historian, I would expect, and maybe readers would expect, that I would, I don't know, set the record straight, and tell you the true or the definitive story, right? I would wade through all the misunderstandings, but it became clear to me that in a memoir, for me, I was less interested in arguing with people or the gotcha or let me show you what I can do. I do show you what I can do as a researcher and as a descendant today in the 21st century. But it was very important to me to respect and take seriously even the what in my family had been regarded as tall tales. And so I hope that those sit alongside the story I tell rather than being sat on or corrected by the story I tell.
I want to correct something that you just said. I couldn't process it, but you were saying you didn't see yourself as a historian. Was that as historian when you were working on this book? Because I mean, you're trained as a historian.
Absolutely. Well,
So,
no, but it's to say, I don't write this book. I try not to write this book as a historian, which is to say, now you can testify. There are no footnotes in this book, and that's
yeah, but
that.
we know how sometimes we could look at the length of your sentences and say, well, this has a certain academic tone.
Well, thank you, sir. There's a tribute or not to my literary capacities. But
Well,
no,
what I'm saying is, I didn't come across you writing about any of your relatives who didn't have a navel like a Toni Morrison character.
touche. But it's important to say that the absence of the footnote is a challenge to a writer like me. Why? Because I understand that if I am to persuade you, I have to persuade you on the page, right?
But you're also drawing upon, and I think you say this in your book, you're also drawing upon eavesdropping and gossip and stuff like that. So to me,
Mhm.
what sort of ethical
Mm,
guidelines are you violating?
mm. That's a great question. I think that I hope I haven't violated any ethical guidelines. Um, Maybe you'll tell me what you think those lines
Well,
might
we're
be.
gonna put this show
Yeah.
into your permanent file.
Yeah. Thank you very much. But and perhaps it's not enough to say, that the disclaimer is that this is my version of the story. And that when I am speculating or inventing or imagining or dreaming, which I do on the page, I signal that to the reader so that I don't mislead the reader about the difference between what I know in a historical archival sense and what I believe or what I feel. I hope I mark those different voices, right? Those different tones, that different tenor on the page. But you had asked me about family, and it is also true that members of my family have been on this journey with me, in conversation, in seeing me talk about bits of the book in progress. Others of them read the manuscript before it went to the final press. And overall, I have been very fortunate that, my generation, the cousins, I did an event a couple of weeks back in Cambridge, Mass, and toughest audience ever is your 10 cousins sitting in the back of the room as you talk about your family, their family, our family. I consider myself, very fortunate to have generous, and that's it, right? Generosity.
Right.
Even if we disagree, generosity about that.
Well, let me ask you one last question before we take our little break. You explore in the Trouble of Color 5 generations of your family history. Okay. Which generation was the most interesting for you to do research on, and why?
It was the generation of the early 20th century, because that generation is wedged between a 19th century generation that I knew a lot about because, in a sense, because that was where my historical work had largely been situated, and the post-World War II generation, which I knew because I lived with them and among them. But that generation of the early 20th century is not one I had known, and it's not one I had studied. And in some ways, we can talk about they were the scariest because they were transgressive in ways that I had to really sit with and make some peace with, I think.
Right. Well, I'm glad that you're sitting with me this morning. My guest today is Martha Jones. She's the author of The Trouble of Color, an American Family Memoir. The show's On the Margin. My name's Ethelbert Miller, the station story PFW 89.3 FM.
Peace. This is your social justice calendar for the week of March 10th, 2025. On Thursday, March 13th at 5:30 p.m., there's a community conversation at Cleveland Park Neighborhood Library, 3310 Connecticut Avenue Northwest. The DC Guaranteed Income Coalition will host a panel on how guaranteed income programs change the lives of DC area families and liberate people in poverty. RSVP at bit.ly/DCGIC Community Conversation. On Friday, March 14th from 6:30 to 8:30 p.m., there will be a discussion on transracial adoption, a conversation with Ethiopian international adoptees. It is located at Sankofa Video Books and Cafe, 2714 Georgia Avenue, Northwest Washington, D.C. More info can be found on sankofa.com. Sunday, March 16th is Black Press Sunday, 10 a.m. at the Metropolitan AME Church, 1518 M Street Northwest in Washington, D.C. Join the Metropolitan Association of Black Journalists to celebrate the 198th anniversary of the Black Press and the 60th anniversary of the Washington Informer. The WPFW Social Justice Calendar connects you with the heartbeat of grassroots activism in the DMV. Submissions can be emailed to socialjustice@wpfw.org. Please include the name, date, and address of the event. Submissions are due by Thursday at 5 p.m. at least 1 week in advance of your event. WPFW Social Justice Calendar helps build a better world, one broadcast at a time.
Okay, we're back on the margin with my guest, Martha Jones, the author of The Trouble of Color. Martha, I wanted you to read, 2 pages from your book that I think would be nice to people. It's the afterword, but it still gives you a sense of your writing and your voice.
Thank you. And I think you've already teed this up a little bit. So thanks so much. I waited until the passing of my parents' generation to write these stories down. This was not out of fear or vengeance. Instead, this book emanates from longing. It was my chance to talk again with ancestors, to revive our conversations, and to begin new ones. In each generation, many people in my family strove to write down truths that went far beyond facts and figures. I learned from their ideas. I also argued with their interpretations and rethought their conclusions. I marveled at their contradictions and broke with some of our most often repeated anecdotes. The stories that, once upon a time, they told birthed me. I, in turn, have birthed the tales told here. I have always been a pack rat, at work collecting the materials that appear in this book. Filed away in my basement are notes passed to me in 7th grade Spanish class, diaries, letters, greeting cards, and news clippings. My grandmother encouraged just this when I was only a toddler. My mother helped by saving many of her letters. I was just 2. We lived in an Upper Manhattan walk-up when my grandmother began to send me keepsakes. An envelope arrived, and in it was a news clipping titled, "Bennett Development is Credit to Jones," a posthumous assessment of my grandfather's work for the college he had headed. My grandmother's cover note anticipated the person I am today. "Dear Martha, this is for your keepsake box." With this, she set me on a path, collecting pieces of the past and toward this book.
Listening to Martha Jones reading from her book, The Trouble of Color. Martha, I want you to talk about, in chapter 7, Color, you discussed E. Franklin Frazier and his 1957 book, Black Bourgeoisie, and talk about the problems that you had with that book.
Where to begin? I had never read Frazier's book, a classic of sorts in Black Studies, until I myself was a graduate student in the 1990s. And in a sense, it shattered my illusions about the people I came from, about the folks we sometimes refer to as the talented 10th. It shattered my illusions about skin color. It shattered my illusions about HBCUs and a whole lot more. It really rocked my world. And it might have stayed just that kind of book that is on my shelf, but I don't take down very often. But when I began to do some digging for this book, I realized that among Frazier's papers at Howard University's Moreland Spingarn Library is an exchange between Frazier and my grandfather from the 1920s. They had known each other all of their adult lives, bound together as ambitious young Black men in Atlanta in the 20s, and really cleaving to one another in important ways by the 1940s, when they are both targeted by the FBI and agents of the Cold War and labeled subversives. So I'm trying to understand less Frazier. Others have done, an important job with that. But I wanted to understand how someone like my own grandmother, who clearly was in Frazier's crosshairs as a type, how she might have thought about that. And in a sense, I certainly don't have anything that she ever said or anything she ever wrote down to go on. I really have her own demeanor. I think my grandmother surely knew of Frazier's critique. She hosted him anyway in her parlor at Bennett, in the president's house. And I think she, how can I say, I think her interpretation of her life, where she came from, who she came from, how she came to be who she was, really is a counter to Frazier's kind of sociological take on people like her. And I wanted readers to sit with that tension, if you will, between how others see us and how we see ourselves.
I'm glad you used that word tension because, when I being at Howard, I always thought about, first of all, E. Franklin Frazier was darker than, say, Rayford Logan, Mordecai Johnson, Sterling Brown, the whole bunch of people who were much lighter than him. And I got a feeling like, other than was maybe Kelly Miller running around there, he was pretty much isolated in terms of, quote, the talented 10. Maybe they didn't give him a key to the library or something like that. But you could see, when you put him in the context, most of the people around him are lighter than he is.
Absolutely. And Frazier's telling us something very important about the problem of colorism. There's no doubt And that in part is why he rocks my world, right? Because he says all the things out loud. And there's no, we say like there's no unseeing, right? Black bourgeoisie. And on the other hand, my question was, is there another story or a companion? What is the companion story, right? And what is the story that I'm going to say we tell, right? And I think that, my grandmother's story is silence, right? I think it's not a takedown of Fraser. It's not a challenge to Fraser. It's not an undermining of Fraser. To the contrary, I think that my grandmother extended to Fraser, all the courtesies that she would extend to any, distinguished visitor to Bennett. But I also think that if pressed, she would not have let him be the last word on what it meant for her to be the descendant of women who had been sexually exploited as enslaved people and whose skin she inherited. That's part of the story too. And Fraser knows that. But I think in his text, transforms that into a parody, right? Of that very true facet of our history.
Okay. I want you to take us from Howard University, take us down to Amistad, the Amistad Center in New Orleans, because that was a very important facility for you to visit in terms of helping you with your research.
Yeah. The Amistad, as folks will know, along with Moreland Spingarn and the Schomburg, it was for a very long time one of the very few repositories, not only that received, right, the papers of Black luminaries, but honored them and kept them safe and well and made them available for researchers. And that's where the papers of my
Talking about safe and well, how did that institution deal with Katrina?
Well, it does well with Katrina as a physical place. Of course, it sits on the campus of Tulane, and there are many repercussions for Tulane. But it is also true that the Amistad fares, the physical objects fare well. Both the papers and the art collection. They also have a remarkable art collection.
Is it an organization that you have to go visit, or are there things that you could do online and use their facilities?
There's some things online. I'm not so familiar with their online holdings, but the papers of my grandfather and of his brother are only available for visitors who make the trip to New Orleans and visit the Amistad. So the Amistad is, it's the kind of institution that we are, profoundly indebted to, because it makes the work of historians possible, but it also makes the work of family historians possible when they want to slog through the boxes and the folders, as I certainly did. But I find things there, some of which are, unsettling and unexpected, others of which are moving. I find preserved there 3 or 4 sheets of paper written in pencil by my great grandmother, Jenny Jones. Jenny had been born enslaved in Eastern North Carolina, lived to see freedom, to raise her own family. Somewhere along the way, she learned to write, and her son preserves these remarkable fragments that tell me so much about who she was. She's a woman of faith, as a mother and a grandmother, and a matriarch for generations of the Joneses. There in just 3 or 4 very slim, fragile sheets of paper, almost scribbled in pencil.
You write about, and you describe this in your book, about being in a dialogue with your family. And I was wondering, how does one deal with the silence in Black households? People who don't want to talk.
I think that certainly by the time I get to the more recent generations, I'm very conscious of the way in which I am going to breach one version of our family code, right? And that family code is one about silence. And yet, as I said as I was saying earlier, this is my story, and part of my story is about rethinking ways of being, including silence and shame. And I think my willingness, my insistence on writing down those parts of the story that had been silenced and kept private, including the history of sexual violence as it was visited in the lives of the women in my family, was to say that we live in different times in the 21st century. If my grandfather's generation was reluctant to tell those stories in a full-throated way, they had reasons for doing so. They were before Roots, right? They were before, if we could just mark them, right? They didn't have, this sort of sea change moment in which we all could begin to say unequivocally, not only that this was our history, but that we were proud of that history, right? That we marvel at the generations before us who endured enslavement, who survived, and those who did not. We honor them. Well, that is a historically contingent perspective. And so I think the thing I would say to them, and I think implicitly I say to them in the book, is, in our time, we have Harriet Jacobs, right? And Jacobs is our guide through some of the most unspeakable, right, aspects of our past. But Jacobs is our guide, right? She holds our hand. She leaves us her text. And I benefit from that. And that's what I would tell them, is that for us, we have the capacities to tell stories that perhaps correctly were too difficult to tell.
Well, talk about the story behind your birth certificate. And I wonder why you placed that story at the end of your book and not the beginning.
Well, the short answer to your question is that I really want that to be that story to be a dialogue with my mother, and rather than the opening to the book. Though I take your point as an astute reader, how it might have been. My birth certificate, which I look at carefully for the very first time when I'm about 19 years old and I'm getting my first passport. This is often when people first look at their birth certificates.
Yeah, they're looking at them now.
Yeah. And what do I see? Well, I see my mother recorded as white. That doesn't alarm me. I know who she is, the child of German and Irish immigrants. But my father is also recorded as white. And this is one of those moments, Ethelbert, when that's one of those encounters, right, with the jagged color line. Like, what on earth, right? What on earth has happened here?
And now the detective, you come in to play.
Thank you. So, in real time, I asked my mother. My mother tells me a lovely story about how, or, a not so lovely story about how when I was born, my father wasn't there. He was, sitting on the curb on West 51st Street, waiting for somebody to bring him upstairs. And then her story was the doctor looked at her, he looked at me, pale thing that I was, and marked us all as white. And it was done. And I might have left it there. But you're right. For writing this book, I come back one more time to that birth certificate. And for the first time, the name of the physician rings a bell. And I realize this is the same physician who delivered my siblings. I had heard my mother speak of him. Who was he? In the 21st century, it takes about 10 minutes, right, to get at least a first take on who someone is. And he's a Black physician who records us as white. He's not only a Black physician, he's a Black physician who was a friend of my father's sister-in-law, who herself was a physician in New York. And I begin to think he knew precisely who we were. And again, it's one of those moments. Is he being a trickster? Is he,
Mhm.
is it a rebuke? Unfortunately, nothing I was able to uncover can answer that. And my brother just asked me, did I want to correct the birth certificate even today? And I said, now it's sort of become part of my story, right?
Right.
I understand it as a part of my story, and in fact, the way in which at birth, right, I'm sort of caught along this color line in a wounding kind of way. So I don't think I would change it. But when I was young, I thought I might. I thought I
I always
might.
think about changing my father's, but because my father's born in Panama, and it was always the question about, is his name Egberta or Egberto? And I realized that when you look at the birth certificate, you can't determine whether it's an A or an O. But I said he's Latino. It's a Egberto. It's not Egberta, you know. But I want to go and Martha Jones, as we get to the end of our show. When I was reading about you going to Copenhagen, um, I couldn't think of how much it sounded like Nella Larson, in
Hmm.
19 between 1910 and 1912, going to Copenhagen. And I said, "Is this a passing novel that you were seeing here?"
Well, I mean, but I'm not sure if I'm flattered or I'm frightened by the Nella Larson comparison, but I'm gonna allow it for the purposes of this conversation, and to say that you're not wrong, right? That going to Copenhagen or straying anywhere very far from where I am known or my people are known is a dilemma that I live with until today, right? And how many times in a day are you going to correct or establish or somehow signal to people who you are, and remind them or cue them into how their eyes are playing tricks on them because they don't have the kind of cultural uh, landscape that we do to recognize all the hues and all the shades that we come in. um, I can appreciate, as I did in Copenhagen, in intimate circles and knowing circles, that it becomes easily part of the conversation. But it is also true that on the train or in the shop or on the streets, I live a life then and now in which on many days I leave the assumptions to stand,
Mhm.
because I think that if I could just borrow gently from Morrison, if I let that form of racism drive my everyday, I wouldn't get to my work. I wouldn't get to
Hmm.
the
Well, what about a member of your family, Fannie Williams?
yes.
Talk about her
Fanny,
as we get to the end of our show.
sure. Fanny, my great grandmother, born enslaved just on the cusp of slavery's abolition in Kentucky, spends her adult life in St. Louis. And Fanny uses her skin to trick the eyes very deliberately, delightedly so.
Hmm.
She sits where she wants in a movie theater. She shops as she prefers in a department store. Um, and this is Fanny's way of uh, pushing back against Jim Crow. And she was, I learned, not alone in St. Louis, and I think not alone in many places to do so. Franny frightened me for a long time because I understood that she and I shared that capacity. Um, and I came to um, admire her for her own kind of challenge to the profound, cruel, violent illogics of race in America.
Well, that brings me to a key question I want to ask you because it's a question that you raised in your book, and I will give you an opportunity to answer that question. You know what that question is, Martha Jones? Who do you think you are?
Mm.
Can you answer that question now that you have a book?
I can, and the answer is, please read the book, and you will learn, because what I discover, right, is that the dilemmas, the qualities, the strategies, the hurt, I know these are my people, right, and
Mhm.
if to know them is to know a great deal about me. even if it's not quite everything you might want to know.
Well, talk about how, as we come to the end of our show, talk about how this book is open to it. I mean, you're using this book, you're going to different places. Um, how is this book being received? How helpful is it to people?
Yeah, thank you. I am learning two things. It turns out that even as there is very little we can talk about it as Americans when it comes to politics and much more, we still can talk to each other about family. And I am moved by how open people are to sharing the many kinds of families from which they come and their dilemmas around identity, which are not always mine. I'm also meeting Black elders who have been the keepers of family stories for a very long time and are asking themselves what happens to those stories now, as I anticipate no longer being here in a bodily sense to hold those stories. And so I hope the book is at least one opening for thinking about not only how we hold stories, but how we pass them down and we leave them to next generations to tell and to retell in their own way. They're too precious, I think, those stories to lose. But I appreciate the elders who have carried them for us and worry even now about whether and how they'll be preserved.
Hmm. Well, this has been a very, very interesting conversation for me. I think I'm going to keep this program so that when I teach my next memoir class
Mm.
in the fall, I can make reference to you. You were very kind to sit in on my workshop last year, and I felt that you had a copy of your book, but I could see from the people in the workshop they were very excited, like, okay, how did she do this? And
Mm.
so
Mhm.
I could see how very important the work you're doing is for other people who have families to say, okay, I want to write my family. How do I do this? And you've given us a good example of the path or the blueprints that we need to be successful. So I want to thank you, Martha.
Well, coming from you, that is extraordinarily high, generous praise. And I do thank you for the workshop and for all the ways in which you model who we aspire to be, who we can be, and what we can do with the word and the page. And so I thank you so much for the opportunity to talk
Well,
with you
you've
today.
produced a very, very important book. My guest today has been Martha Jones. She's the author of The Trouble of Color, an American Family Memoir. The show's On the Margin. My name's Ethelbert Miller. The station's WPFW 89.3 FM. Okay.